Welcome to part 2 of our 4-part series. Today we talk about private market innovation, but also the supply chain issues when considering ESG. It'll be critical to know how and where the inputs to technology were created, such as the lithium, the copper, the graphite, and other metals. All of these will have scores attached to them, and that will make a considerable difference in the future.
We're getting bogged down a lot in trying to deal with the many messages, say it just in the West alone, on political fronts, like you said, in a time whenever, if we could, and no one wants, this is challenging because you don't want to say, like, here's the boogeyman in the room. Although I think we do have to, if we could band under that, like that, this is happening over here on the other side. We probably shouldn't be squabbling over either the spoils or the riches, because we're far from that right now. Let's all band together and make sure we have a foothold to grow, because there's no doubt in my mind this is growing over here. And we see daily, as far as the BRICS nations, it seems to be strengthening. There's indications that even, there's been steps closer with Afghanistan and investment from like China oil that's been happening, which would mean also maybe opening up all the mineral rights there if they get along well with ISIS and Taliban, which then takes us further to the Saudi Arabia seems to be softening a little bit as well. Is that this really starts to define this multipolar world that you're talking about?
Exactly. And when the splintering directly benefits Beijing, but also when there's a common adversary, this should be the easiest time in the world to be on the same page. But I think this is also a dynamic where it makes me more excited about opportunity and progress in the private sector, because, the capitals, they will bang their heads against the wall, find themselves always squabbling over the least important things. But then if you look at the private sector, which to my mind should be where industrial innovation and industrial movement comes from to begin with, because we exist in free markets, but also that's somewhere where across the board, among, again, trusted economies, there does seem to be a real incentive to partner toward this end. And that's encouraging in terms of the potential for progress, and also the potential for progress from an actual center of gravity.
Yes, and this is a good time to talk about your fund a little, because GM just announced a $650 million deal with Lithium Americas. Before that, there was an MOU with Ford and a company called Lake Resources down in South America for lithium. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of this, not only because of the encouragement from the Biden administration, the infrastructure bill, harnessing and focusing on nuclear, on battery energy tech, on starting to build out the infrastructure, the old grid that we have that we need to update and get going. These not only are, I think people don't understand the gravity and size and scale of these kinds of projects, and they think, oh, that's overwhelming. But that's also a level of growth that could be, I won't say guaranteed, but certainly definitely could be a massive driver moving forward. That's where that, if we can get through this middle part, this really chaotic part, every time throughout history, when we've had these types of changes, it's tough, it's ugly, but then when it takes off, it goes, and it goes fast.
Yes. And at this point right now, it's this pairing between these incentives for industrial innovation and also these new regulatory demands. For example, you can't rely on Chinese products, or inputs. You can't rely on Chinese inputs with forced labor, whether that's polysilicon or primary aluminum. And those regulatory constraints are only going to grow. And in that environment, suddenly, there's opportunity not only for the lithium, new lithium players, new lithium technologies, but also for ones that have a new business model, because the business model for so long has been reliance on China. And yeah, that's precisely the opportunity we're targeting. And as you said, it's only going to grow, right? So the early stage player that has new innovation that stakes out a key node in one of these value chains now, that demand is going to grow, but so is the ability to expand into other points of the value chain, whether that's horizontal or vertical growth. And it's an interesting field where the narrative realization is kind of there about this opportunity. And there are some bigger players that are getting into this in terms of investing in later stage players, but there remains so much opportunity at the early stage that hasn't been capitalized on. and at the early point in value chains. And where, again, like the ability to navigate regulatory and political trends gives outsized advantage.
Huge. And I know, someone say on the right or more free markets, they think like they cringe when they hear regulatory. Oh, this is terrible. But like I like to put a caveat on that, because in this regard, especially when you're dealing with, say, environmental waste or anything like that, it's a real positive. Like if you're forced to do things at a regulatory framework, that is a huge advantage actually to the West, let's say, because China gets away with a lot. They have, and they always have been. A lot of developing countries kind of get, they're trying to grow. If you force that, and I'm not saying it's the ESG model, but if you force a model where you're saying, we need to know where you're sourcing, was it done properly? And this doesn't have to be, nitpicking, but like Indonesia is kind of known for dumping into the ocean. You can't do that. You can't do some basic stuff that actually lends, I would say, that kind of regulatory framework where you say, we've got a framework to be good and kind to the environment, to do the right thing. That's going to only help, I think, the West than anything else, than hindrance. It's not the same idea of an already market with more regulation. It's that, no, this is an area where you want some, you need some, and that could actually, I think, be a very big boon for someone like yourself who understands the policy and the framework, and then to convey that message to investors saying, this is a good thing, this works for us.
Yes, exactly. And there are different kinds of regulatory frameworks that I think hit differently for someone who, like me, believes in free markets. And there are ones that impose like restrictions on players that break free market rules and impose transparency. And that actually, I think makes the market work better. And then there are regulatory frameworks, which are the government putting its hand on the wheels and saying, this is where money should go, picking winners and losers. And that's much more distortive and works less well, especially in our system. And I think because, as you said, we're in a chaotic environment, there are growing pains updating for today's regulations. People aren't necessarily sorting one of those from the other. But it's a really important distinction in terms of what's going to be productive moving forward.
And it's tough too when we've got, this is a very historic time, and I'm not even using that loosely. There's so much change. There's so much change that most people, we're coming out of COVID, we're coming out of a pandemic, which was enough for any person to deal with, just mentally. Then you're going into, look at all this change. It's easy for the average investor, even a fairly well-informed investor, to be overwhelmed with what's going on. And then a topic, even if it is regulation, becomes so politicized that they go, no, we don't want regulation. So we're trying to get a message across to show that there's an opportunity here, and that nuance, for anyone who's willing to listen and kind of take a step and break back and go, I'm the same way. I'm a free markets guy, but I believe in some regulation. I think we have to do things right, do them properly. I'm a value investor, but also values. I think that matters. But that nuance, I think, if someone can have it and be open to the conversation and think critically, there's a huge, that's where the opportunity is. And they can kind of go, that's noise. I don't need to have a comment on that. I think what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to your initial point of how do you sort the signal from the noise? Because we use all these words to say the same thing, we use one word to say a lot of different things.
Yes.
Is what I meant with that.
Yes.
And in this case, I think, the regulatory environment is precisely one of them. And some of these, new quote unquote regulatory trends are going to be much more lasting than others. And when I think about, in particular, the regulations vice China thing, so, for example, requirements on knowing sourcing, on not doing business with Chinese military entities. First of all, I think of those as responses to China breaking free market rules.
Yeah.
So it's not actually saying, let's move away from our free market focus. It's saying this is a player that's distorting a free market system, and how do we defend it? So it's actually more in favor of, to repeat the term, the free market, than not having these regulations. But also it's responding to a long-term continuing and escalating reality, which is geopolitical tension with China. And the industrial and economic competition that creates, which is not going away. So other elements of the noise in the regulatory landscape, and in the US examples, are everything from antitrust vice tech to ESG. Those might, I don't see those necessarily as enduring trends. They could just be whims of the political moment or whims of today's zeitgeist. Whereas, as we've seen from the past 5 years, this question of an industrial competition with China and what it means at a regulatory and political level, that's not changing, and that's only going to increase.
And that's interesting. You wrote in the Octavian report, there's an article called Squeeze Play, and you touch on this, and we're not going to focus too much on the finance or the lending, but I think there was a couple key points you made in there that it just kind of highlights what you're saying, and maybe kind of let people know, and we'll give you the links to read this as well. But I think it's important for people to see some of this activity at work.
Yeah, and that piece was bigger picture, but about China's lending internationally, which I think points to the tension, China's distortive role, and also the tension between China and the rest of the international system. And I wrote that relatively early in COVID, when the economic disruptions from COVID were causing real chaos in emerging economies, and emerging economies that had become newly dependent on loans from China. And it's funny because I think that piece is a couple years old, but it's actually very relevant right now because of the Zambia debt restructuring question, which is a whole new test of what's going to happen in an environment where African economies in particular are suddenly bound to Chinese loans more than ever before. But basically, early in COVID, G20 agreed that they would let emerging economies off the hook for some period of time on loan repayments. And China said, oh yes, of course, except if the loan comes from our Exim Bank, we're going to figure this out bilaterally, which was a real way to claim they were playing along with the G20 and actually be pretty not only opaque, but probably, although all of the negotiations, most of them were behind closed doors, probably pretty coercive, vice the economies that they depend on, which is one element of distortion. But then there's a bigger picture there, which is China's role as a lender in the international stage. And China has figured out this amazing position for itself, where the World Bank still classifies China as an emerging economy, even though it's at least the second largest, by some measures, the largest economy in the world, and therefore lends to it at like 1% interest rate loans. And then China goes back and lends to emerging economies at interest rates of between 4 and 6%. And obviously, like, money's fungible. So effectively, like, what Beijing is doing in this dynamic is taking cheap money from the World Bank and then selling it back higher to emerging economies.
That's an amazing
who the
model.
World Bank is supposed to be supporting.
Yeah. I mean, that's when I read that, I was like, that is incredible that opportunity exists for them. And so, I mean, we can talk endlessly about why that is, whether that was to appease them in the hope that if we make it easy for them, they'll comply to some other rule. I try to leave those types of conversations, because they can go on indefinitely, of intention, because it's tough for me to know what the intention is. I mean, it seems kind of obvious to some degree with China, but I really wanted to have people hear that without getting into the big conversation of finance or loans, because it sets the stage further as to the opportunity that they've taken and they've harnessed on years in advance to leapfrog them as to where they are.
And it also underscores, like, these are the kinds of things that there's going to be pushback on. And who knows when the World Bank loans will be the question, or when what will, but there are so many elements of China's international positioning that run directly contrary to either the spirit or the law of the international system. And one by one or two by two or whatever we want to say, like, these are going to come to the fore, and it is going to increase the amount of tension